Some choices echo through eternity, carved not in marble, but in the trembling hands that refuse to hold the executioner's blade. Marcus Aurelius Carnifex stood in the shadow of the Colosseum's killing floor, his calloused fingers wrapped around the hilt of a sword that had tasted more blood than any weapon should, and felt the weight of Rome itself pressing down upon his scarred shoulders like the judgment of angry gods. Before we continue, remember to subscribe to Sand, Blood and Chains, where the stories that history feared finally speak again. The morning sun cast long fingers of light through the iron bars of the gladiator quarters, illuminating dust motes that danced like the souls of the dead, and Marcus could taste the copper-tinged air that spoke of violence yet to come. He had been summoned before dawn by Flavius Maximus, the Lanista whose word was law in this domain of sand and suffering, and the message had been simple enough to understand, yet impossible to accept. 23 condemned prisoners awaited execution in the private chambers beneath the arena, and Marcus had been chosen to deliver their final judgment. The selection was not random. Marcus had built a reputation over 8 years of competition as a man who could kill cleanly and efficiently, without the theatrical flourishes that other gladiators used to prolong their victims' agony for the crowd's entertainment. He took no pleasure in death, found no joy in the screams of the dying, approached each combat with the cold professionalism of a craftsman practicing his trade. The audience respected this efficiency, the Lanista valued this reliability, and the other gladiators envied his ability to end fights quickly without seeming to be affected by what he had done. But what none of them understood was that his detachment was not strength. It was the carefully constructed armor of a man who had learned that feeling too much would destroy him. Every death he delivered in the arena carved another scar across his soul. Every life he took added another ghost to the army of accusers that haunted his dreams. It was not an unusual request in the grand scheme of imperial entertainment. Rome demanded blood, and gladiators existed to provide it in whatever form the crowd's appetite required. Private executions were considered a privilege reserved for the elite, a more intimate form of violence that allowed wealthy patrons to witness death without the distracting chaos of public spectacles. Marcus had performed such duties before, though never for so many condemned souls at once, never with such a complete roster of the forgotten and the damned. But as Marcus made his way through the labyrinthine corridors that honeycombed the foundation of the great amphitheater, his footsteps echoing off stone walls that had absorbed decades of screams, he found himself thinking of his daughter's face the last time he had seen her. 8 summers old, with eyes the color of spring leaves and a laugh that could have taught the birds new songs. Livia had been born in the slave quarters attached to the gladiator school, the daughter of a Celtic woman who had been captured during the campaigns in Gaul and who had died giving birth to the child who would become Marcus's only source of light in a world built entirely from shadows. The girl had grown up surrounded by violence and death, but somehow she had managed to preserve an innocence that seemed impossible given her circumstances. She would sit by the training yards and watch the gladiators practice, not with the bloodthirsty excitement that characterized most spectators, but with a strange sadness that suggested she understood the tragedy being enacted before her eyes. On quiet evenings when there were no contests scheduled and the arena fell into temporary silence, Marcus would tell her stories of the world beyond Rome's reach, tales he had heard from other slaves about forests where druids still practiced their ancient magic, about northern lands where the sun barely set during summer months, about islands across the western sea where kings and queens ruled with wisdom rather than fear. She would listen with the absolute attention that only children can give, her small hand resting in his massive one, her breathing slow and peaceful, as if his voice could create a sanctuary that violence could not penetrate. She had been taken by fever 3 winters ago, in a plague that swept through the slave quarters like divine wrath, claiming the young and the old with equal indifference while leaving the strong and healthy untouched. For 5 days she had burned with heat that seemed to come from the very center of the earth, her small body convulsing as her spirit fought against whatever force was trying to drag her away from the world she loved, despite its cruelty. On her deathbed she had looked at him with those perfect green eyes and whispered, "Papa, when you go to the sand tomorrow, remember that killing doesn't make you strong. Being kind when everyone expects you to be cruel, that's what makes you strong." The words had emerged from her fever-cracked lips with the clarity of prophecy, as if in her dying moments she had been granted access to truths that the living could not perceive. He had dismissed it as the fevered ramblings of a dying child, the innocent philosophy of someone who had never faced the brutal arithmetic of survival that governed every moment of a gladiator's existence. In the arena, kindness was weakness, and weakness was death, and a man who hesitated to kill his enemies would find himself bleeding out in the sand while the crowd cheered for his conqueror. The world had no place for mercy, no use for compassion, no patience for those who chose love over the necessities of survival. But her words had haunted him through 47 victories in the arena, through the crowd's roaring approval and the emperor's golden coins, through nights when he lay awake listening to the groans of dying men and wondering when his own number would be called. Today, as he approached the heavy wooden door that separated him from his assigned task, those words felt less like the naive hopes of a child and more like a prophecy that was finally demanding its fulfillment. The condemned prisoners were chained in a circle at the center of a circular chamber lit by torches that cast dancing shadows on walls stained dark with old blood. 23 souls who had been judged unworthy of life by the great machine of Roman justice. Thieves and rebels, deserters and foreign spies, men and women whose only crime might have been existing in the wrong place when the empire needed examples made. They looked up at him with eyes that held every emotion human hearts could contain: terror and resignation, defiance and desperate hope, the particular hollow acceptance that comes to those who have already begun the process of dying. Marcus recognized some of them from the holding cells where they had been kept while awaiting their fate. There was Gaius, a young soldier who had fled from battle and been sentenced to die for cowardice, his face still bearing the soft roundness of youth despite the shadow of death that hung over him. Beside him sat a woman named Helena, convicted of practicing forbidden religions, her lips moving in silent prayers to gods whose names were no longer permitted to be spoken in the territories Rome claimed as its own. An old man called Theophilus, his hands marked with the calluses of a lifetime spent working stone, condemned for leading a strike among the quarry slaves who had demanded food for their families. There were others whose stories Marcus could only guess at from their appearance and bearing. A woman with elaborate tattoos that marked her as coming from the northern tribes, probably captured during one of the endless frontier wars that fed Rome's appetite for slaves and territory. A man whose soft hands and educated bearing suggested he had once been a person of importance. A teenage girl whose only crime might have been being in the wrong family at the wrong time, when political winds shifted. Each face told a story that Marcus did not want to read. Each pair of eyes held accusations that he was not prepared to answer. These were not the hardened criminals or dangerous enemies of the state that the pronouncements from the imperial court had described. These were people, frightened, flawed, human people who had made choices that the machinery of empire had deemed unforgivable, and now they waited for him to complete the process of their erasure from the world. The weight of his gladius seemed to increase with every breath he took, the familiar leather grip suddenly feeling foreign in his palm. He had killed hundreds of men in the arena, had ended lives with the clinical precision that years of training had burned into his muscle memory. But those deaths had been part of the game. the sacred ritual of combat that transformed murder into entertainment and gave meaning to the spilling of blood. This was different. This was execution, pure and simple. The methodical elimination of inconvenient lives by a representative of the state's will. Marcus found his gaze drawn again and again to a young boy who could not have seen more than 12 summers, chained between two adult prisoners and staring at the floor with the particular stillness that comes to those who have retreated so far inside themselves that the external world can no longer touch them. The child's crime, according to the documents Marcus had been shown, was theft. He had stolen bread for his younger sister, who was dying of hunger in the streets outside the city walls. As Marcus watched, the boy raised his head, and for just a moment their eyes met across the space between hunter and hunted. In that instant, Marcus saw his own daughter looking back at him, saw the same innocent bewilderment that had filled her face when the fever took hold, and she realized that all the stories about heroes and justice and the protection of the righteous were just stories after all. The boy's lips moved, forming words too quiet to hear, but Marcus thought he recognized the shape of them. Please. The gladiator's hand began to tremble, a tremor that started in his fingers and spread up his arm like the onset of disease. He had faced lions and bears in the arena, had stood against champions whose names were legend throughout the empire, had looked death in the face so many times that fear had become just another sensation to be acknowledged and dismissed. But standing in this chamber of the condemned, with his daughter's voice echoing in his memory and a child's silent plea burning in his vision, Marcus Aurelius Carnifex felt something crack inside the armor of indifference he had spent years building around his heart. He turned away from the prisoners and walked to the far wall of the chamber, where shadows pooled thick as spilled wine, and pressed his forehead against the cold stone. The rough surface felt real in a way that nothing else seemed to at that moment, grounding him in the physical world when his mind threatened to spiral into the abyss of moral complexity that yawned before him. Behind him, he could hear the soft sounds of human suffering, the rattle of chains, the whispered prayers, the quiet weeping of those who had abandoned all hope except the hope for a quick and merciful end. "I cannot," he whispered to the darkness, his words barely audible even to himself. The admission felt like a blade twisting in his chest, but it also carried with it a strange sense of relief, as if he had been holding his breath for years and was finally allowing himself to exhale. "I cannot do this thing." But even as he spoke the words, he knew that the simple act of refusing would not be enough. This was Rome, and in Rome, disobedience was its own form of death sentence. If he walked away from this chamber without completing his assigned task, he would be dragged before the same tribunals that had condemned the people currently awaiting his sword. His refusal would be seen as rebellion, his mercy interpreted as treason, his moment of human compassion transformed into evidence of his unfitness to serve the imperial will. Yet as he stood there in the torchlit darkness, Marcus began to feel the stirrings of something that had been dormant inside him for so long he had almost forgotten its existence, the capacity for hope. Not the false hope of victory or survival that sustained most gladiators through their brief and bloody careers, but the deeper hope that came from the possibility of choosing to be something other than what circumstance and necessity had made him. He thought about the layout of the prison complex, the guard rotations he had observed during his years in the Ludus, the hidden passages and forgotten chambers that honeycombed the foundation of the great amphitheater, like the burrows of some vast underground creature. There were ways out of this place that did not involve the official entrances, routes that led to the sewers and catacombs beneath the city, paths that could carry desperate souls away from the machinery of imperial justice if someone with knowledge and determination was willing to guide them. The plan formed in his mind with the same tactical clarity that had served him well in the arena, each element clicking into place with the precision of a well-oiled siege engine. It would be dangerous, suicidally dangerous, and the chances of success were vanishingly small. But it would be something other than simple obedience, something other than the mindless execution of orders that reduced human beings to problems to be solved with sharp steel and imperial authority. Marcus pushed away from the wall and walked back to the center of the chamber, his decision crystallizing with each step. The condemned prisoners looked up at him with the same desperate attention they might have given to a priest delivering last rites, their faces reflecting the terrible vulnerability of those who wait for strangers to decide whether they live or die. But instead of drawing his sword, Marcus knelt down and began examining the chains that held them. "Can you run?" he asked quietly, his voice pitched low enough that it would not carry beyond the circle of condemned souls. The question seemed to hang in the air like incense, heavy with implications that everyone understood, but no one dared to voice aloud. The woman, Helena, was the first to respond, her voice hoarse from hours of silent prayer. "Where would we run to? This is Rome. There is nowhere in the world that Roman law does not reach." "Perhaps," Marcus replied, his fingers working at the mechanism of her shackles with the same focused intensity he brought to combat. "But there are places where Roman law moves slowly, places where a person might disappear into crowds or wilderness long enough to build a new life under a new name. The choice is yours. Die here in certainty, or live long enough to discover what possibilities exist beyond these walls." One by one, he moved through the circle of prisoners, freeing them from their chains with tools he had acquired through years of careful observation and patient planning. Some wept openly at the sudden reversal of their fate. Others remained silent, perhaps unable to believe that salvation could arrive wearing the face of their appointed executioner. The young boy who had reminded him so powerfully of his lost daughter simply stared at his freed hands as if he had forgotten what it meant to move without the weight of iron dragging at his wrists. But freedom within the confines of the prison complex was only the first step in what would need to be a much longer and more complex journey. Above them, Marcus could hear the sounds of the day's first gladiatorial contests beginning. The roar of the crowd, the crash of weapons, the particular acoustic signature of violence performed for entertainment. The noise would provide cover for their movement, but it also meant that the corridors would be filled with guards and officials whose attention might be drawn by any unusual activity in the areas typically reserved for the condemned. Marcus gathered the freed prisoners around him, his voice low but clear as he outlined the route they would take through the labyrinth beneath the amphitheater. There were maintenance tunnels that connected to the city's sewer system, emergency exits that had been built into the structure during its construction and then forgotten by subsequent generations of administrators. The journey would be treacherous and the destination uncertain, but it would give them a chance. Perhaps their only chance, to write endings to their stories that did not involve dying at the pleasure of Roman crowds. If you're still here, stay until the end. The truth hidden in the final moments will change everything you believe about this chapter of history. The escape began in silence. 24 souls moving through stone corridors like shadows fleeing the approach of dawn. Marcus led them through passages he had mapped during sleepless nights, when the weight of accumulated violence made rest impossible, past chambers where other condemned prisoners waited for their own appointments with imperial justice, through spaces that existed in the gaps between official architecture and acknowledged purpose. Above them, they could hear the sounds of the day's entertainment beginning, the roar of crowds responding to announcements, the clash of metal against metal as gladiators engaged in their deadly dance. The noise provided cover, drowning out the small sounds that even careful movement through stone passages could not avoid completely. They were perhaps halfway to the first checkpoint when the sound of running footsteps echoed from the direction they had come, accompanied by shouts that carried the particular urgency of guards who had discovered that their charges were no longer where they were supposed to be. Marcus felt his heart clench as he realized that their absence had been discovered much sooner than he had hoped. "Quickly," he whispered, gesturing for the group to follow him down a side passage that led toward the amphitheater's lower levels. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder and more organized. They had minutes at most before the hunters would overtake their prey. As they moved through the darkening passages, Marcus found his thoughts turning to the other gladiators who would soon discover his absence. Brutus Maximus, his training partner and closest friend in the ludus, who had saved his life during a particularly vicious contest. Cassius the Unconquerable, the veteran fighter who had taken him under his wing and taught him the subtle arts that kept gladiators alive long enough to earn their freedom. These were men who had become brothers in everything but blood, bound together by shared danger and mutual dependence in a world that offered no other forms of genuine human connection. What would they think when they learned of his choice? The questions burned in his mind as he guided the escaped prisoners through increasingly narrow and treacherous passages. They reached the entrance to the sewer system just as the first torchlights appeared in the corridor behind them, carried by guards whose voices had taken on the excitement of hunters closing in on wounded prey. The opening was small and crude, designed for maintenance access rather than human passage, and it would require each person to crawl through a space barely wide enough to accommodate a grown man's shoulders. But it represented their only remaining route to the world beyond the amphitheater's immediate reach. Marcus helped each prisoner through the opening, his hands steady despite the growing sound of pursuit. The young boy who had reminded him of his daughter went last among the prisoners, pausing for a moment to look back at the gladiator with eyes that held gratitude too profound for words. "Thank you," the child whispered. And Marcus felt something inside his chest break open like a flower that had been waiting years for the right moment to bloom. "Run fast and far," he replied. "Build a life that justifies what this moment cost." The boy nodded and disappeared into the darkness beyond the opening, followed by the last of his fellow refugees. Marcus stood alone in the corridor for perhaps 10 seconds, listening to the approaching guards and calculating the time it would take him to follow the escapees into the sewers. He could still make it if he moved immediately, could still preserve his own life, and perhaps find some way to build a future beyond the reach of imperial retribution. Instead, he turned back toward the sound of approaching torches and began walking toward his captors, with the same steady pace he had always used when entering the arena. Some choices were about survival, but others were about the person you discovered yourself to be when survival was no longer possible. This was not about preserving his life or ensuring his own freedom. This was about ensuring that the guards would be too focused on capturing the escaped gladiator to pay proper attention to tracking down the escaped prisoners. The confrontation, when it came, was brief and decisive. Marcus made no attempt to resist capture, offered no violence against men who were simply doing their jobs, submitted to chains and interrogation with the same dignity he had always brought to the rituals of combat. Under torture, he revealed nothing about the route the prisoners had taken or the assistance he had provided in their escape, maintaining a silence that was absolute and unbreakable, even when pain became the only reality his world contained. The interrogation lasted 3 days, conducted in chambers deep beneath the amphitheater, where screams could not reach the surface to disturb the entertainment above. They used techniques perfected over centuries of imperial expansion, methods designed to break the strongest will and extract truth from the most stubborn lips. But Marcus had learned endurance in the arena, had discovered reserves of strength he never knew he possessed, and he drew upon those reserves now to protect the people whose lives hung in the balance of his silence. They broke his fingers one by one, searching for the weakness that would make him speak. They applied heated metal to his flesh, seeking the precise combination of agony that would overcome his resistance. They deprived him of sleep and food and water, trying to wear down his defenses through systematic degradation of his physical condition. But through it all, Marcus held to the image of his daughter's face, used her memory as an anchor that kept him tethered to his purpose, even when everything else threatened to dissolve in waves of overwhelming pain. The trial was a formality, the verdict predetermined by the simple facts of the case. Marcus Aurelius Carnifex, gladiator of Rome, had been found guilty of treason against the state, sedition against imperial authority, and conspiracy to aid enemies of the Roman people. His sentence was death by crucifixion, to be carried out at dawn on the Appian Way, where his body would serve as a warning to others who might consider placing personal conscience above civic duty. On the night before his execution, lying in chains in a cell beneath the city, Marcus found that his thoughts had turned not to regret or fear, but to a curious sense of completion. For the first time in his adult life, he had acted purely from moral conviction rather than necessity or expedience, had chosen to be the person his daughter's dying words had challenged him to become, rather than the person circumstances had shaped him to be. He never learned what became of most of the prisoners he had helped to escape, but rumors reached him during his final days that suggested at least some had successfully made their way beyond the immediate reach of imperial justice. A merchant from Gaul mentioned seeing a group of refugees seeking passage to Britannia. A Syrian trader spoke of former slaves working in the silver mines beyond the northern frontier. Stories without confirmation, whispers without proof, but they were enough to kindle hope in a heart that had almost forgotten what hope felt like. The young boy who had reminded him so powerfully of his lost daughter was said to have reached the Christian communities that flourished in the shadows beyond imperial oversight, where former prisoners and escaped slaves could find sanctuary among people who believed that every human soul carried infinite worth, regardless of the judgments pronounced by earthly authorities. The story might have been wishful thinking or deliberate fabrication, but Marcus chose to believe it because believing it made his approaching death feel like something other than meaningless waste. They crucified him on a grey morning when the sky threatened rain and the air carried the scent of approaching winter. As the nails pierced his flesh and his body was lifted against the wood that would become his final arena, Marcus thought about the moment in the underground chamber when he had looked into a child's eyes and seen his own daughter looking back at him. He had made his choice in that instant, traded his life for the possibility that innocent people might live to see another dawn. And he found that even with death approaching like a tide that would not be turned back, he could not bring himself to regret the transaction. The crowd that gathered to witness his execution was smaller than those that filled the amphitheater for gladiatorial contests, but it carried the same hungry energy that characterized all Roman spectacles of death. They had come to see justice performed, to witness the punishment of a traitor who had placed sentiment above duty, mercy above law. Some threw stones and shouted curses. Others watched in silence that might have been approval or might have been discomfort at seeing a former champion reduced to this final degradation. But Marcus heard none of their voices, felt none of their stones. His consciousness had turned inward, focusing on memories that pain could not touch, his daughter's laughter echoing through the gladiator quarters on quiet evenings, the grateful tears of a young boy whose life had been spared, the faces of 23 condemned souls walking toward freedom through underground passages that led away from imperial justice and toward whatever futures they could build for themselves beyond the reach of Roman law. Years later, when the empire that had condemned him lay in ruins, and new civilizations had risen from its ashes, Stories were still told about the gladiator who had chosen mercy over duty, who had sacrificed everything to save people whose names he had never learned. The tales grew in the telling, became legend, became myth, until the man they described bore little resemblance to the scarred fighter who had spent his final moments hanging from Roman wood and thinking about his daughter's laugh. But in the Christian communities that had found safety beyond imperial reach, in the remote settlements where escaped slaves had built new lives under new names, in the quiet corners of the world where mercy had triumphed over law, the truth was preserved. A gladiator named Marcus Aurelius Carnifex had looked into the face of state-sanctioned murder and chosen compassion instead, had traded his life for the lives of strangers because a dying child had once told him that true strength came not from the ability to kill, but from the courage to be kind when kindness required everything you had to give. The young boy who had reminded him of his daughter did indeed reach the Christian communities that flourished in the hidden places beyond imperial oversight. He grew to manhood in a monastery built into the mountains of Gaul, where former prisoners and escaped slaves could find sanctuary among people who believed that every human soul carried infinite worth, regardless of the judgments pronounced by earthly authorities. As an adult, he took the name Lavinius in honor of Marcus's daughter, and spent his life copying manuscripts and preserving the stories of those who had chosen love over power, mercy over justice, compassion over the cold necessities of survival. Gaius, the young soldier who had fled from battle, eventually made his way to Britannia, where he joined a community of former legionaries who had grown weary of conquest and sought meaning in cultivation rather than destruction. He learned to work the land with the same dedication he had once brought to military drill, and in time became known for his skill in growing crops that could feed communities during harsh winters. His children and grandchildren never knew of his conviction for cowardice, knew only that he was a man who understood the value of peace because he had seen the true cost of war. Helena, the woman who had been condemned for practicing forbidden religions, found her way to a community of believers hidden in the deserts beyond the empire's eastern borders. There she became known as a healer and teacher, sharing the compassion that had sustained her through imprisonment and near death, with others who sought refuge from the machinery of imperial power. Her prayers were said to have miraculous properties, though she always insisted that any healing came not from her words, but from the love that connected all living things in an invisible web of mutual dependence and care. Old Theophilus never lived to see the fullest fruits of his sacrifice, dying of a fever contracted during the arduous journey to freedom, but his example had inspired other workers in the quarries outside Rome. And within a decade of his escape, the entire labor system had been transformed through a series of strikes and negotiations that proved organized resistance could achieve what individual heroism could not. The changes came slowly and at great cost, but they came, and the workers who benefited from improved conditions never forgot the old man, whose courage had shown them that dignity was worth fighting for, even when the odds of victory seemed impossibly small. The woman with the northern tattoos returned to her homeland, where she became a storyteller whose tales of Roman cruelty and gladiatorial mercy were woven into the oral traditions of her people. Her accounts of Marcus's sacrifice became part of the cultural memory that sustained tribes through their resistance to imperial expansion, proof that even within the machinery of conquest and domination, there existed individuals capable of choosing humanity over duty, love over obedience. The educated man who had been stripped of his wealth and status discovered that his knowledge of languages and administrative procedures made him valuable to the underground networks that helped other refugees escape from imperial justice. He spent the remainder of his life coordinating safe passages and forging documents, using skills acquired in service to the empire to undermine its authority and protect those it had marked for destruction. Some of the escaped prisoners were never heard from again, disappearing into the vast anonymity of the ancient world, where a person could reinvent themselves completely if they were willing to travel far enough from their origins. But even their silence was a form of victory, proof that the imperial machinery of total control was not as efficient or complete as it claimed to be, that there remained spaces in the world where mercy could triumph over law and individual conscience could override institutional authority. The guards and officials who had been responsible for the prisoners' security faced varying degrees of punishment for their failure. Some were demoted or transferred to less prestigious assignments. Others faced financial penalties or temporary imprisonment. A few were themselves condemned to the arena, forced to fight for their lives as entertainment for crowds who had no idea that they were watching men die, for the crime of being insufficiently vigilant in preventing an act of compassion. But none of them could undo what Marcus had accomplished in that underground chamber. 23 people who should have died that day lived instead, carried forward into futures that the imperial justice system had tried to deny them. Their survival was a small crack in the facade of invincible authority that Rome projected, a demonstration that even at the height of its power, the empire could be challenged by individuals willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of moral principle. The Gladiator school, where Marcus had spent his final years, continued to operate for another generation before finally succumbing to the economic pressures that accompanied the empire's gradual decline. By then, the men who had known him personally were mostly dead or too old to fight. But his story had become part of the informal curriculum that older fighters passed down to younger ones. New gladiators would hear about the champion who had given up everything to save condemned prisoners, and some of them would look at their own situations with eyes that had been opened to possibilities they had never considered before. They said his ghost still walked the tunnels beneath the ruined amphitheater, guiding lost souls toward freedom, offering hope to those who had been condemned by the harsh arithmetic of survival. The stories might have been true or false, but they were remembered, and in being remembered they became more real than the imperial pronouncements that had once seemed to carry the weight of eternal law. Travelers passing through the ruins of Rome in later centuries would sometimes report strange encounters in the underground chambers, a sense of presence in empty corridors, the sound of chains being broken in rooms where no chains existed, glimpses of a tall figure leading groups of people toward passages that seemed to lead nowhere, but somehow always provided escape from whatever dangers threatened. The accounts were dismissed by rational minds as folklore and superstition, but they persisted with the stubborn vitality that characterizes truths too important to be destroyed by skepticism or logic. In the end, Marcus Aurelius Carnifex had become exactly what his daughter had predicted he could be, not because he was stronger than other men, but because when the moment came to choose between cruelty and kindness, between obedience and conscience, between survival and sacrifice, he had found the courage to choose love. His victory had not been won with sword or shield, but with the simple decision to see condemned prisoners as human beings deserving of life, rather than problems to be solved through violence. The empire that had condemned him eventually fell, as all empires do, brought down by the accumulated weight of its own contradictions and the resistance of those who refused to accept that power alone could determine right and wrong. New kingdoms and civilizations rose from its ashes, experimenting with different relationships between authority and individual conscience, seeking to carefully build new societies where true mercy might flourish alongside perfect justice. And in all of these transformations throughout the centuries that followed, the story of a gladiator who had chosen compassion over duty served as a reminder that even in the darkest times, even when the machinery of oppression seemed invincible, individual acts of conscience could change the world in ways that no amount of force or authority could achieve. Marcus had planted seeds that would grow into forests, had lit candles that would kindle bonfires, had chosen love at a moment when love seemed impossible, and in doing so had proven that his daughter's dying words contained more wisdom than all the libraries of imperial scholarship combined. If this story moved you, subscribe to Sand, Blood and Chains. Here, the forgotten truths of the ancient world live again, no matter how hard history tried to erase them.